We're alive. Hello, J.E. Krieger, author of the books of 9 and 10 Penance, and back again for another author reading from my novel. Let's see if I got it here. There we are. I should have it. The Magic Paintbrush, and I changed things up. I'm not at the park again tonight. I'm actually at home. Thought I would do the reading from my desk. Although I do enjoy doing the readings at the park, it's not always that easy. So, but you know, I'm doing these earlier, which is kind of nice. But anyways, I'll be reading from my book, The Magic Paintbrush. We are on chapter, what is it now? Chapter 8. The Fragonards' Dream in the Garden of Rococo. That would be the chapter I'm reading from tonight. And thanks to everyone who has been listening. Since I am at home, I thought while I'm reading from this book, I would at least have something for you guys to view. I've got the second version of Starry Night I painted. And then, of course, I've got some drawings I did. And there's my little deity guy I drew. And a couple of books I wrote. And a surrealistic looking flower. A couple of flowers, if you will. So anyways, I thought I would do that tonight instead. Yesterday was the anniversary of my writing journey. July 7th, 2012 is when it all began. Well, tonight's chapter should be fun. This is probably one of my favorites, if not my most favorite chapter in the book. Oops, now I lost the page. I'll have to find it again. So let's see, where did we leave off? The King's New Castle was the previous chapter, and Fragonard and Botticelli had painted the kingdom from rags to riches with the help of the magic brush. And so now we're going to have, I got to find the chapter again. So now Fragonard is going to have a dream of his own with that magic paintbrush in this chapter. And we almost got it. Here we go. Fragonard's Dream in the Garden of Rococo. And I gotta tell you, I had a lot of fun with this. I knew I'd have a chapter in there like that somewhere where Fragonard gets to borrow that brush and has a fantastical dream with it. And I think after this chapter, things take quite a drastic turn. But this one was just a lot of fun. So I will get right into it tonight, and you guys can view this beautiful art that I made. If you want me to flip to another page, let me know. Okay, here we go. Fragonard's Dream in the Garden of Rococo. The months quickly passed us by. Winter was now a daily chore for our people to contend with. The windows were covered in frost, and the streets were a mess of ice and sleet. Renoir could barely keep up with the demand for overcoats and hats. Instrom and his daughter had their work cut out for them, serving up warm bowls of soup to keep everyone fed. I remember Grantwood came into town one day, struggling to pull his horse and cart through the piling drifts of snow. Landseer offered to lend him a helping hand, but he wouldn't have it. He was as stubborn and ornery as that old horse of his. Botticelli had become a recluse, as the weather had withered away his bed of grass and flowers to nothing more than an icy chill, too cold to sleep on. He would wake every night and stand atop the bell tower. There he would stay until morning, tirelessly gazing out into his once glorious field of strange and surreal flowers. Try as he may to rid himself of this problem, his magic wasn't powerful enough to combat against the determined forces of nature. It seemed he would just have to wait until spring for everything to melt before he could enjoy his garden of paradise, reminiscent of his dream. By midwinter, the Arctic winds started to settle in across the fields, bringing with a white haze of dense flurries that blanketed the landscape. You could barely see the two hills poking out of the distance in this frozen wasteland. I tried cheering him up with a few paintings to remind him of the summer months and the coming spring ahead. He continued to pine as he toiled over the impossible, unable to accept defeat. Then one night, during a terrible blizzard, an idea spontaneously came to him in his dreams. He simply made the castle walls taller and curved to carry the prevailing winds elsewhere. Then he pulled a star from the nighttime sky, placed it above the bell tower, and was able to keep his flowers in bloom. It created this magical bubble of warmth stretching all the way to Grantwood's farm. The people graciously applauded him. It was a much-desired summer dream had by all. I spent most of my days painting and hanging my artwork up around the castle. Throughout that time, I longed to use his brush to create something magical of my own, but he was always too busy with some menial task brought on by my father or one of the villagers. So one evening during a full moon, I went looking for him, to see if perhaps we could paint the stars like we once did before. I'd learned so much since the last time I played with them. I was hoping to get a chance to show him how much I'd improved. To be honest, I was growing bored with the usual things I painted. The spark of inspiration had withered, and the fields had lost their luster on the canvas. I longed for change, desiring a real challenge I could tackle and master. It was then when I finally understood why he stared at the stars every night. He was searching for a new dream, an unreachable paradise hidden amongst the heavens somewhere. I went out to the fields and found him asleep atop the two hills under the shade of that tree he was so fond of. The brush was already in his hand, as if he planned on staying awake to paint another masterpiece of his choosing. I didn't want to disturb him, and besides, his dream had already come to fruition, and mine was still waiting to be crafted. So I carefully removed the brush from his grasp, assuming he wouldn't mind if a like-minded master borrowed it for a little while. I then snuck away into the courtyard with a painter's palette of my own. There in the courtyard, I thought of all the wonderful things I could create with this dry and withered canvas of autumn before me. One thing for certain, the hedges were in need of a good pruning, or we'd be fighting them back when summer rolled around. Some of them were so out of shape, they resembled something closer to a furry beast rather than a work of art. I began hacking away, taming this hairy animal that needed to be properly groomed. I trimmed and pruned spires of blue rhombuses, sliced and diced cinnamon sticks out of the rose bushes, and gingerbread loaves out of the hedges. I found the more I created, the bolder I became. Neapolitan evergreens, lemon drop ash trees, and a bardillo of licorice twists hanging in the willows. The garden was cleaning up nicely when I noticed some vines strangling the life out of a box-shaped boxus. It looked completely entangled. Snarled by its own tail. I just couldn't allow a blemished spot to tarnish my masterpiece in the making, so I unwound this leafy ball of green thread and coiled it around a trellis set against a bell tower. Then I thought, what else could I breathe new life into? The flower beds were hibernating from the cold winter frost. I could easily handle this with a few simple strokes, but I was desiring more, a real challenge I could sink my teeth into. Then I remembered the night Botticelli had on the island, and all those beautiful flowers he'd told me about that had broken free from their stems. I wondered if this might be a way for me to practice, until I unlocked more of the secrets behind the magic of his brush. I smeared some yellow paint on a wilted dandelion. Then I curiously tickled under the gentle lip of its chin to see if I could get it to wake up. The dandelion let out a loud yellow roar as it fluttered its petals to life and flew away. I was ecstatic. It actually worked. I swabbed some lavender on a tulip and waited to see what would happen. It slowly opened its petals and yawned. Then it hopped off its stem and started buzzing about like a hummingbird. I tried this magic on an orchid next. To my amazement, it lifted off its stem and glided away like a ballerina dancing for my amusement. I was having so much fun I decided to paint all the flowers in bloom, releasing them from their nocturnal slumber. The air was illuminated with sugar plum lilies, streams of yellow magnolias, ribbons of midnight blue pansies, and twinkling aloft with periwinkle carnations. They swayed, waltzing in ornamental arrangement under the direction of my magic wand of sorts. My dreams truly came to life in a way I never thought imaginable. I'd crafted a masterwork of art on a living, breathing canvas. It was as if a fairy tale had come to life out of the pages of a book. Satisfied with my efforts, I found a nice, comfortable spot on a bed of nesting lilacs and lay down. Soon thereafter, I fell asleep to buttercups, bluebells, and zinnias zigging and zagging out of my sights. It was absolutely marvelous. You should have been there. Hours later, I woke in a chamber of greenery, trapped in a forest of barberry, boxwood, and octotus. I had unknowingly unleashed a spell with the magic of the brush, placing an enchantment of mammoth proportions over the entire garden. The flora and fauna must have been bathing in the fountains while I slept, slurping up this enchanted oily brew until there was nothing left. I took the sharp end of my brush and carved out an opening in this wall of green to see how bad things had gotten. On the other side, it discovered a dense jungle of exotic colors and leafy green oddities. There was no real path to follow, only the flowers fluttering freely about in a chaotic haze of sparkling dust drifting by in the air. I knew I had to paint it away before sunrise, or I would be in a lot of trouble with Botticelli, and even more so with my father. I could hear him speak to me in the back of my mind. You should have been tending to the chores, my son, instead of resting on the job. His robust voice, the disapproval in his tone, I knew he was right. I should have been more responsible with my actions, but pining over it wasn't going to solve anything. There was only one way to win this fight, plain old hard backbreaking labor and a gallant effort to stick with it. With no time to waste, I traversed my way through this labyrinth of no-good shrubbery. I got right into it, swashing and slashing. I fought back a thorn bush, jousted with a juniper, maimed a marigold, and had a chat with the statue of a deep-thinking thinker. I believe his name was Thomas Eakins. He rambled excessively about theory of concept or concept of theory as he walked in circles on a roundabout. I'm not really sure where he was going with any of it, although the plants seemed to enjoy his lofty banter. Try as I may, my efforts to maintain a garden were to of no avail. I kept lapping on stroke after stroke, but the oils on my palette only seemed to be fueling this leafy mess, causing everything to thrive and flourish. The pathways I'd already cleared out grew back in twice as thick, and the hedges were as plump as an apple. The flowers I'd so easily brought to life acted more like mosquitoes, things to swat and shoo away. I was constantly nipped by tulips and orange blossoms. The snapdragons were the worst of it. Such a nuisance. Little fiery beasts with wings. I plucked them petal by petal, but still, they kept coming back for more. I cut back a thicket of purple prickly pear and wandered into a tunnel made by the overhanging trees. It led me into a different part of the garden, one I don't remember Botticelli or I creating. The topiary was beyond surreal, an amusement park of abstract sculptures in obscure shapes. It had a dreamlike quality, magnificently bizarre, almost haunting in an artificial way. There were trapezoids and spherical objects set on pedestals, hanging whirly-dazzlers, and succulents feasting on the flowers that would land down and take a drink of their sweet yet deadly nectar. The hedgerows had these giant oval swoops carved into them. They were artistically crafted with arcs inclined at odd angles and uneven stripes graffitied into their foliage. It created these magical portals, peering into an exhibit of weird and exotic plants. I saw a green hand reaching out of the ground, grasping at the moon, its fingertips almost grazing the edge. There was a one-eyed peacock waving its colorful plumage. This bulbous, misshapen ewe was stooped over, happily chomping on some honeysuckle, while a hedgehog played possum nearby. The artistry was exquisite, far beyond my capabilities. There was no possible way I could have created this in a night, but I wondered, who could have done this while I was asleep, dreaming of all those beautiful flowers? I sat down on a bench with my head in my hand. There had to be a way to put everything back to normal, but how do you combat against something this cunning and invasive? I just needed to think outside of the box of flora and fauna I had contained myself in. While I was musing over the daffodils gliding in the air, the conifers began squawking and ruffling their foliage. I got up and looked on ahead down the path to see what had spooked them. The hydrangea cackled like a hyena, and a whole nest of conifers spread their wings and flew away. Staring straight at me was a mean and nasty hornbeam. It huffed and puffed, stomping its hooves. The beast let out a primal roar. It then broke free from its roots and charged, thrashing everything in its path. The garden sculptures got down from their pedestals and began acting like wild animals that had just been released from the zoo. I raised the brush in the air, ready to strike this armada of leafy green carnivores when a clematis crept up and coiled around my legs. They knocked the palette out of my hand, reached out and took the brush from my grasp. I was pulled to the ground and woven into a bushy trap. I kept twisting and turning, but my attempts to break free only made the vines grow tighter. With a bit of hourglass thinking, I rolled over my palette, covering myself in splotches of paint. The flowers swooped down in large swarms, nipping and pinching, feasting on the oils until their bellies were full. They cut through just enough of the vines for me to wiggle free. Unfortunately, however, by then the brush was nowhere to be found. Then it occurred to me, of course, I should have known all along. I looked up the bell tower. Those slimy green snakes were spiraling toward the top with it, seeking the warmth from the star Botticelli placed there to keep this garden of paradise from frosting over. I couldn't be outdone by a common garden pest. What would I tell Grantwood? He certainly would shake his head at this one if he ever found out. So I began climbing to the top, fighting tulips and daisies along the way, knowing full well if I couldn't end it here, then the world would be next. Or at the very least, I'd be grounded for a month and a half. With one foot leaned in and a hand barely holding on to the trellis, I reached out to tug on the brush. The vines latched onto my arm and we began wrestling back and forth for control. It looked like a mongoose fighting a lizard's tail at a distance. I forced the tip against the winding of its throat. It released the brush into my hand, giving into my pleasure. I gave it a swipe across the neck, striking with some gusto in a thick layer of impasto. In response, it grew back 3 more vile snakes at the head of this hissing monstrosity. The slimy green tentacle then yanked the brush right from my grasp. I lost my footing and fell from the bell tower with the sigh of relief as I landed softly on a thorn bush. I noticed something while I was pulling the thistles out of my bottom. Concealed by a box-shaped hedge was the core root of all of this, pulsating and throbbing in various shades and hues. I ripped out a knotted mess of weeds, crawled under the hedge, and then I rolled up my sleeves and I pulled with all my might, till finally I'd untangled this garden of Armedia that had strangled my dreams all night long. The vines quickly withered and died. It was a cruel thought, but hopefully they'd spring back in the summer and live again, though maintained by a sharpened pruner's knife. With the vines defeated, the flowers landed back on their stems and went to sleep. I corralled the flamingos and the hippos and giraffes and the other wild things I'd unleashed back to their respective boundaries in the garden. Now all I had to do was restore the courtyard before the early morning bell rang. Everything was dripping wet, saturated in an oily mess. It was far beyond repair, so I wiped myself a clean slate. Then I softened my palette with flushes of silky pearls, creamy hues, and pastelic mauves. I used rosy shades as to make things jocular and fluid. Rather than leaving it a chaotic mess for me to clean up later on, I chose a graceful approach this time, decorating with ornate motifs and garnishing them with juicy pinks and minty greens. I used simplistic highlights and red chalky lines to lighten the mood, giving things a rustic quality more pleasurable to the eye. I made sure the strokes were broad and clear, loose yet vigorous with a lucid paleness, allowing for a more passionate composition to show. I then blurred out any rough edges by using a robust color scheme in the foreground and dark silhouetting outlines in the background. When I was done with the restoration, the artist in me was dying to leave behind a signature on my work. Most of the statues had already been repaired or replaced, all but two that had their faces removed. Lavina and Sculptura, two sisters I knew from when I was very young. I thought, why not? They should stand atop pedestals and on the faces of these two marbled beauties. I hoped they wouldn't mind if I borrowed them for my muse. I hadn't seen them since they moved to the countryside on the other side of town. Now that the task of hard labor was through, I rushed off to where Botticelli still lay asleep on his bed of flowers atop the two hills, and just before sunrise, I put the brush back in his hand, vowing to never mess with the painter's magic ever again without his consent. And there you have it. That's, I think, Chapter 8. Fragonard's Dream in the Garden of Rococo. So tomorrow night, same time, 7 o'clock, I'll be reading, Chapter 9, The King's Portrait. And in that chapter, that's when things really start to take a turn. Fragonard's father has his portrait painted by Botticelli. So we'll have to wait and see what happens next. And of course, thanks for everyone for tuning in and listening. Go ahead and subscribe if you want to keep hearing me read these chapters. But I've got it up on Amazon Kindle right now. I think it's $2.99. That's pretty reasonably priced, I think. Or you can just continue to listen along as I read chapter by chapter here on YouTube. But it's been a lot of fun doing this. I did it all last week, and I'll read up until Friday this week, and then there'll be, I think, 2 more weeks of it to finish off the book, and then who knows where I'll go from there. But there you go, and there's the art I did that I had, and I'll show you this before I go. Let's see. Hold on. I wanted to show you the artwork. I couldn't put it in the book, but it's on the Kindle version on Amazon. And so there's the original, the second version of Starry Night. Let's see, here we go, right here. And that's the piece of art I did for that chapter, right there. Fragonard's Dream in the Garden of Rococo. Okay, thanks for tuning in, and I'll hopefully see some of you back tomorrow night.